When I was told I was dying, I thought the cruelest part would be the countdown. I was wrong. The real cruelty came the same night. When I tried to tell my wife and she broke down, first confessing she'd been seeing someone else. I hadn't even said the word cancer yet. When the doctor looked at me with that quiet, serious expression that people reserve for breaking bad news, I already knew what he was about to say even before he spoke the words aloud, because no one asks you to sit down in that tone unless something life-altering is coming. And sure enough, when he finally told me that I had an aggressive stage of cancer, the kind that didn't offer much of a timeline, I felt the world tilt slightly out of place, as though gravity itself had shifted just enough to make breathing feel unnatural. I remember nodding as he explained the details, though I couldn't hear half of it because the sound of my own heartbeat filled the space between us like a slow, hollow drum. It was almost funny in a tragic way, because I had gone into that appointment thinking maybe I just needed a stronger inhaler, and instead I walked out with a printed packet explaining how to prepare for the inevitable. On the drive home, the world looked both the same and entirely foreign. The gas station at the corner still had the flickering light above pump 3. The old man who walked his dog at the same time every afternoon was still there, wearing his usual faded cap, but everything felt distant, as if I was watching it all from the wrong side of a glass wall. I remember thinking about how strange it was that the world could just keep moving when mine had quietly stopped. I didn't cry, not then anyway, because I think my mind hadn't caught up yet. Instead, I thought about logistics, about what needed to be done, about how to tell my wife Emma in a way that wouldn't break her heart completely. Emma and I had been married for 8 years, and we had reached that comfortable stage of marriage where arguments about bills and grocery lists somehow coexist with a deep affection that doesn't need to be spoken every day. She had always been the practical one in the relationship, the one who handled tax forms and doctor's appointments, while I was the one who remembered to buy her favorite tea whenever it went on sale. We worked as a team in a quiet, ordinary way that felt solid. Which is why the idea of telling her that our time together had a countdown terrified me. I pictured her reaction a dozen different ways during that drive home. I imagined the tears, the disbelief, the long silence, followed by a determined resolve to fight it together. What I didn't imagine was what actually happened. When I finally gathered enough courage to tell her, I waited until after dinner. I had cooked her favorite meal, hoping to cushion the blow in some small way. We sat together in the living room with the soft hum of the dishwasher in the background. I told her that I had something serious to talk about, and I could feel my voice trembling slightly, though I tried to sound steady. But before I could even begin to say the words, she suddenly looked at me with wide, panicked eyes and started to cry. I was startled because I hadn't said anything yet, and for a moment I thought maybe she already knew. She covered her face with her hands and said through her sobs that she was so sorry. I remember staring at her, trying to understand what she was apologizing for. My mind raced through possibilities, none of which made sense in that moment. I reached out to comfort her, but she flinched slightly, as though she couldn't bear to be touched. Then she looked up at me and said that she knew what I had found out. I was confused, so I asked her what she meant, and that's when she blurted it out, that she had been seeing someone else for the past several months. There are moments when the air in a room seems to vanish entirely, leaving only the sound of your heartbeat and the distant hum of electricity in the walls. That was one of those moments. I sat there frozen while she kept talking, explaining how it had started with a colleague from work, how she hadn't planned for it to happen, how she felt trapped and lonely. Her words came out in fragments, and none of them made sense because I was still stuck on the first sentence. She had been seeing someone else. That phrase kept looping in my head like a broken record. I don't remember saying much in response. I think I asked who he was, though even as I asked the question I already knew it didn't matter. She told me his name, and it felt foreign in my mouth when I repeated it softly under my breath. She said she had planned to tell me soon anyway because she couldn't live with the guilt any longer. I wanted to tell her then about my diagnosis, about how I was dying, and how cruelly timed her confession was, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Somehow the idea of watching her face crumble twice in one night felt unbearable. So instead I just listened quietly while she talked about love and confusion and how she didn't know how to fix what she had broken. I nodded, though my mind was elsewhere, already drifting toward the horizon of what little time I had left. When she finally stopped talking, she asked me if I hated her. I told her no, which was true in a strange, detached way, because hatred felt like too much effort for a man who had just learned his clock was running out. That night, I lay awake in the dark, listening to her breathing beside me, wondering how two people could share a bed and still feel separated by miles of invisible distance. I thought about the irony that I had been preparing to tell her I was dying, only to discover that, in a way, our marriage had already died first. The house felt too quiet and the shadows on the ceiling seemed to shift in unfamiliar shapes as if the walls themselves were listening. By morning I knew that I couldn't tell her yet about the cancer. Not now, not after what she had confessed, because if I did she would stay out of pity and I couldn't bear that. I wanted her to leave because she wanted to, not because she felt obligated to care for a dying man. I didn't want to become a burden or a guilt-driven charity project in her new narrative of self-discovery. So I decided I would keep my diagnosis to myself for now, at least until I figured out what to do next. As I sat at the kitchen table the next day staring at my untouched cup of coffee, I realized that my life had split neatly into two timelines. One was the man I had been before that week, full of plans and ordinary joys, and the other was the man sitting there now quietly counting down days he hadn't even lived yet. And somewhere between those two versions of myself, there was Emma, whose tears still echoed faintly in the back of my mind like a confession whispered into an empty room. At that moment, I didn't know what would come next, only that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The world had cracked open beneath my feet, and I was still trying to decide whether to climb out or let myself fall. The following week passed in a strange kind of silence that didn't feel like peace but more like a truce that neither of us had agreed to. Emma went about her routine as if nothing had changed yet. I could see the tremor in her hands when she picked up her coffee mug in the mornings, and the way she avoided looking at me directly for too long. It was as if we were two strangers trapped in a house that still remembered the couple who used to live there. Every corner carried an echo of something familiar: the faint scent of her perfume on the hallway curtains, the indentation of her side of the bed, the sound of her humming while folding laundry, but each detail now felt slightly out of tune, like a melody I could no longer follow. I kept thinking about how strange it was that the body can still go through motions even when the heart has no idea what it's doing. I went to work each day, nodded through meetings, and answered questions, but none of it registered. The world had shrunk to a narrow tunnel where only the sound of my thoughts could fit. When coworkers asked how I was doing, I told them I was fine, and they believed me because people rarely question a simple answer. No one could tell that inside my chest something enormous and invisible was eating away at both my body and my life as I knew it. In the evenings I found myself watching Emma in quiet curiosity, as if studying a character from a story I didn't quite understand. She would sit on the couch scrolling through her phone with that faraway look in her eyes, and I would wonder if she was texting him. I didn't ask because the answer wouldn't have changed anything. I had already accepted that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Still, there was a certain calm in knowing that I didn't have to fight for her anymore. The energy I once might have spent arguing or pleading was now redirected towards simply staying upright through the day. What unsettled me most was how quickly the house had started to feel temporary. I caught myself looking at objects differently, as though they were items to be sorted into piles of what to keep and what to leave behind. The coffee machine she loved, the bookshelf we built together, the photo frames on the wall, they all looked like artifacts of a life I had already outlived. One night, while she slept, I opened my laptop and began drafting a list of things that needed to be settled before I was gone. Bank accounts, insurance, passwords, little details that make up the architecture of modern life. It was a practical exercise meant to give me a sense of control, but halfway through I found myself staring at the screen, unable to type, because I had reached the part labeled next of kin and didn't know whose name to write. Telling her the truth about my diagnosis would have made everything simpler, at least on paper, but the idea felt wrong. It wasn't about revenge or pride. It was something quieter and more private, a need to keep one piece of myself untouched by her betrayal. She had taken so much already: my trust, my sense of safety, my belief in the quiet permanence of marriage. The diagnosis was the one secret that was mine alone. It was a cruel symmetry, but somehow it felt fitting that we now both carried secrets heavy enough to sink a ship. One afternoon I left work early and drove to the lake just outside of town. It was a place we used to visit during our first year together, when everything still felt new and endless. The water was calm and the sky hung low with the kind of soft gray light that makes everything appear fragile. I sat there for hours without moving, just watching the ripples expand and fade. For the first time since the diagnosis, I let myself cry, not because of fear or anger, but because I finally understood how small I was against the vastness of everything. The tears felt cleansing in a way, though they didn't solve anything. When I finally stood up to leave, the world looked slightly sharper, as though grief had polished its edges. At home, Emma asked where I had been, and I told her I needed some air. She nodded and didn't press further. Later that night, she tried to talk to me about moving out for a while. She said it might give us both space to think. I told her that was fine and meant it. The truth was I wanted the quiet. I wanted to live the rest of my days without pretending. She packed a small bag that evening and promised she'd come back to collect the rest of her things later. When she left, the house felt immediately lighter, though the silence she left behind was heavier than before. Over the next few days, I adjusted to solitude with surprising ease. I cooked simple meals, mostly soup and toast, because the chemo medications were starting soon and I had no appetite for anything complicated. I found comfort in routines that didn't require much thought: watering the plants, paying bills, listening to the same old records. It was a life stripped down to essentials, and it suited me. But every so often I would catch myself glancing toward the empty chair across the table and feel that faint ache of habit where love used to live. A week later, Emma came by to pick up more of her clothes. She looked tired in a way that makeup couldn't hide. There was a faint tension between us, not anger exactly, just exhaustion. As she moved through the house collecting things, she paused at the framed photo from our honeymoon, the one where we stood barefoot on the beach holding each other and laughing at nothing. She turned it over face down without a word, and I felt something inside me fold quietly like paper. After she left, I walked through the house, turning off lights one by one until only the lamp in the living room remained. I sat there staring at the blank television screen, seeing my own reflection faintly in the glass. I looked older somehow, though not just in years. There was a depth in my face that comes only when a person has looked too long into the quiet truth of his own mortality. That night I wrote a letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, just a collection of thoughts I needed to put somewhere outside my head. I wrote about the diagnosis, about Emma, about the strange clarity that comes when you finally realize how little control you have over the story you're living. I ended it with a single line that surprised me when I read it back. I wrote that dying wasn't what scared me most. What scared me was being forgotten before I was even gone. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Then I turned off the lamp and lay there listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Somewhere beyond the walls, life continued its steady rhythm, and I found a strange kind of comfort in that sound, because even as my own story was quietly unraveling, the world outside kept breathing for me. The morning the treatments began, I woke up before sunrise and sat by the kitchen window watching the thin gray light creep over the neighborhood rooftops, and I realized how easy it was to forget that life goes on quietly without waiting for anyone. On the drive there, I thought about how strange it felt to prepare for something that was supposed to help me while knowing it was only meant to buy me a little more time. That idea made me oddly calm. Maybe because I had stopped expecting miracles. Maybe because I had accepted that this chapter was no longer about survival but about understanding what mattered before it ended. The treatment center smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, the kind brewed in those old machines that always taste slightly burnt. The nurse who greeted me had a gentle voice and eyes that carried the kind of warmth that made you feel seen. She introduced herself as Laura and helped me through the paperwork. There was something grounding about her presence, the way she moved with quiet efficiency, as though she had long accepted that life and death existed side by side in the same room, and that neither one frightened her. When she asked if anyone would be joining me for support, I told her no, and she nodded without judgment, just a soft acknowledgement that said she understood. As the hours passed with the soft hum of machines around me, I thought about Emma. I wondered if she had told anyone about her affair, or if she had neatly rewritten the story already. I didn't hate her for leaving anymore, but I couldn't shake the image of her face that night. She confessed, pale and trembling, as if she too had been living with something incurable. Maybe guilt is its own kind of sickness, one that doesn't show up on any scan but eats you slowly from the inside. That thought stayed with me as I left the hospital and stepped into the cool afternoon air. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of fatigue and quiet reflection. I found myself drawn to small moments that used to pass unnoticed: the sound of rain against the windows, the way the light shifted through the trees, the faint creak of the floorboards at night. Each detail felt sharper now, as though life had turned up its brightness just for me. I started taking slow evening walks around the block, mostly to remind myself that I could still move under my own power. One evening during one of those walks, I met my neighbor's son, a young man named Eli who had recently moved back home after finishing his studies. He was helping his mother tend to her garden, and when he saw me struggling with the trash bin, he came over to lend a hand. There was something refreshingly unguarded about him, the kind of openness that made conversation effortless. We started talking casually at first about the weather, about the neighborhood, but soon our talks became longer. Eli worked part-time at a local photography studio and often carried his camera with him. He once showed me a few of his photos on his phone, mostly quiet landscapes, empty streets after rain, reflections in puddles, things that carried a sort of melancholy beauty. He said he liked capturing moments most people walked past without noticing. I told him that was a good way to live too. From that day on, our brief encounters became a regular part of my evenings. He didn't know about my illness, and I didn't feel the need to tell him. It was enough to talk about things that didn't revolve around endings. Meanwhile, Emma's messages began to arrive like faint echoes from another life. They started small, polite check-ins, asking if I was doing all right or if I needed anything from the house she had moved into temporarily. I didn't reply at first. Then one afternoon she sent a longer message saying she wanted to talk in person to apologize properly. I stared at her words for a long time before deciding not to answer. I realized that forgiveness didn't always require conversation. Sometimes silence was the kindest form of closure. As the weeks passed, the treatments began to take their toll. My appetite vanished and sleep came in short, restless bursts. Still, I tried to maintain some normalcy. I kept journaling in the evenings, mostly fragments of thoughts I didn't want to lose. One entry simply said, "I want to remember the smell of rain," and another said, "I wish I had told Emma sooner that I was sick, not because she deserved to know, but because it might have changed how I remembered her." Those words stayed with me for days after I wrote them. One afternoon, while returning from the hospital, I saw Laura, the nurse, sitting outside during her break. She waved and invited me to sit with her. We talked for a while about books, about music, about how some patients found peace in the smallest rituals like tending plants or listening to certain songs. She told me that most people weren't afraid of dying but of being forgotten. I smiled because she had unknowingly repeated the same thought I had written in my journal weeks earlier. When she asked if I was afraid, I told her I wasn't sure. Felt like the truth. That evening I went home feeling lighter somehow, though my body was exhausted. I sat on the porch watching the last bit of sunlight fade from the sky. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp soil, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked lazily. For the first time in weeks I felt a faint flicker of gratitude, not for what I had lost but for what remained. The simplicity of the moment felt like its own kind of grace. Later that night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard my phone buzz again. It was another message from Emma, only this time it was longer. She wrote that she had something important to tell me, and that she didn't want to keep secrets anymore. I stared at the screen for a while before opening the message. Her words were short and deliberate. She wrote that she was pregnant and that the baby wasn't mine. I don't remember how long I sat there afterward, but it must have been a long time, because when I finally moved, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the curtains. There was no anger, no shock, just a hollow calm, as though the universe had finally completed its cruel sense of symmetry. I turned off the phone, placed it face down on the table, and whispered softly to no one in particular that I forgave her even if she'd never hear it. Then I stood by the window and watched the sky shift from gray to pale gold, feeling the slow rhythm of my own breathing, steady and fragile and real. It occurred to me then that sometimes the hardest part of dying isn't the ending itself, but learning how to live through the quiet days that lead up to it. It was a week after Emma's message when I first saw the man I knew had to be the one she had written about. I hadn't planned it that way, and I almost wish I hadn't been there to see him at all, but life seems to enjoy staging its cruel coincidences. I was at the pharmacy picking up my medication when I noticed a man standing at the counter speaking softly to the pharmacist, his arm protectively around a woman who looked visibly pregnant. They were laughing quietly, the kind of shared laughter that only comes from people who believe they've earned happiness after hardship. I remember that my first thought wasn't jealousy or hatred, it was a quiet, detached sense of recognition. That must be him. The man she had left me for. The father of her child. I watched them for a moment longer before turning away because I didn't want to make eye contact. I didn't want him to see the exhaustion in my face and mistake it for bitterness. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit me, and I realized how strange it was that this man who had unknowingly dismantled my life could appear so ordinary, so unremarkable, that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have greeted him politely on the street. It made me think about how betrayal rarely looks like a villain in a movie. Sometimes it just looks like another person buying vitamins for his partner. That evening I sat by the window again, watching the neighborhood lights flicker on one by one, and thought about how small the world really is. It didn't feel like fate, exactly, just a reminder that no matter how far you try to distance yourself from the people who hurt you, you still share the same air for a while. I wrote about it in my journal and ended the entry with a single sentence that surprised me. I wrote that I no longer wished her unhappiness. I only wished that she never felt the kind of hollow peace I was living through. Days went on and I saw Laura, the nurse, again at my next appointment. She greeted me with that same calm warmth and asked how I had been feeling. I told her I was managing, which was true, though the word managing carried an elasticity of meaning these days. As we talked, she asked if I had family close by. I told her my parents lived a few hours away and that my wife and I were separated. She didn't pry, though I could tell she wanted to say something. Before I left, she handed me a small card with her personal number written on it in neat handwriting, and said I could call if I ever needed to talk. I thanked her and put it carefully in my wallet like a charm against loneliness. One afternoon, soon after, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, and when I finally did, I heard a woman's voice, hesitant and nervous. She introduced herself as someone who needed to speak to me about Emma. My chest tightened instinctively, but her tone wasn't hostile. She said her name was Claire and that she was the wife of the man Emma had been seeing. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I sat down slowly and asked how she had found my number. She said she came across an old document that had both our names in it, something Emma had accidentally left behind at the office. She sounded tired, not angry, just worn down. Claire told me that she had recently found out about the affair, though she didn't mention how. She said she wasn't calling to cause trouble, but to ask for honesty. She wanted to know if I had known about it all along. I told her I hadn't, that I only found out when Emma confessed the same night I had planned to tell her I was dying. There was a long silence after that, during which I could hear her breathing quietly on the other end. Then she said softly, "I'm sorry." I think she meant it in more ways than one. We talked for almost an hour, not like two people entangled in the same disaster, but like strangers trying to piece together a puzzle neither of them asked to solve. She told me that she was 5 months pregnant and that her husband had been lying to her all that time, promising he would leave Emma while assuring Emma he had already done so. Hearing her describe it, I realized how parallel our pain had been, two people in different houses living the same quiet heartbreak. When we hung up, she thanked me for listening and said she wished me peace. I didn't have the heart to tell her that peace was a temporary visitor in my world these days. After that call, something shifted in me. The story that had once felt like a wound began to feel more like a closed scar. Knowing that the man who had destroyed my marriage had also betrayed his own wife somehow balanced the equation, though not in a vindictive way. It was just the quiet recognition that sometimes justice arrives not through revenge but through the simple unfolding of truth. I found myself thinking less about Emma and more about the strange intersections of human lives, the way one person's choice can ripple through others like invisible waves. That night, I received another message from Emma, this one more desperate. She wrote that everything had fallen apart, that the man had gone back to his wife, and that she didn't know what to do. She said she wanted to see me to talk one last time. I sat there staring at her words for a long time before replying with a single line. I wrote that some conversations come too late to matter. Then I turned off my phone. The following morning, I went back to the lake where I had sat weeks before. The surface of the water was still calm, but the air had a sharper chill. As I watched the faint ripples move outward, I thought about how life is made up of small circles like that, overlapping and expanding until they fade into stillness. I realized that I no longer felt anger toward Emma or anyone else. What I felt was a deep, quiet acceptance that this was simply how my story had unfolded. When I returned home, I found a letter in my mailbox addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a short note from Claire thanking me for my kindness during our call. She wrote that she had left her husband and was moving to stay with her sister for a while. She wished me peace and signed it with a simple "take care." There was something profoundly human about that small exchange between two strangers bound by shared pain. It reminded me that even in the middle of endings, people can still choose decency. That evening, as I sat watching the fading light through the blinds, I realized that the twist of fate wasn't Emma's betrayal or my illness, but the unexpected grace that had emerged from both. The world hadn't become crueler, though it had become clearer. I understood now that love and loss aren't opposites but neighbors that share a fence. and somewhere in that narrow space between them I had finally found a kind of stillness that felt almost like peace. The day the doctor called I almost didn't answer because I had grown used to those routine check-ins that never carried good news, only confirmations of decline, but something in his voice sounded different this time, quieter, but edged with an odd kind of hesitation that made me straighten in my chair. He said that the latest scans had come back with results that were not what they expected. The cancer had slowed down, not disappeared, but stalled in a way that didn't fit the usual pattern. I asked him if that meant I was getting better, and he said not exactly, but maybe not worse either. It was the kind of ambiguous sentence that sits in your chest like a half-lit candle, neither bright enough to hope nor dim enough to despair. When I hung up, I sat there for a long while, staring at nothing in particular, letting the weight of those uncertain words settle into my mind. The idea that my time might stretch a little further should have felt like a gift, but instead it felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. What was I supposed to do with more time when I had already begun the slow process of saying goodbye to everything? I had given away half my clothes, boxed up the things I thought might help my parents remember me, and now I was being told that maybe the clock wasn't ticking as fast as I thought. I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion because I had finally made peace with dying, and now life was asking if I wanted to renegotiate. That afternoon I went for a walk to clear my head. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain, the kind that lingers in the soil long after the clouds have passed. I found myself walking toward the photography studio where Eli worked, though I didn't have a reason for going there. When I arrived, I saw him standing outside adjusting a camera lens, and when he noticed me, his face lit up with that easy sincerity that made people feel safe around him. He asked how I was doing, and I told him about the doctor's call. He smiled and said maybe life was giving me a second chance. I told him I wasn't sure what I would do with it. He thought for a moment and said maybe you don't have to do anything with it, maybe just being here is enough. The simplicity of that answer lingered in my mind long after I went home. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way sunlight moved across the living room floor, the rhythm of the neighbors' wind chimes, the faint hum of the refrigerator at night. Everything felt amplified, as if the world itself had decided to slow down with me. I found myself writing more in my journal, not about regret or death, but about observation. I wrote that survival is sometimes quieter than anyone expects, and that maybe the miracle isn't in the cure, but in the way a person learns to look at an ordinary day as though it were rare. Emma reached out again around this time, though her tone had changed. The messages were less desperate, more reflective. She wrote that she had been attending therapy, that she was trying to understand why she kept destroying the good things in her life. She said she didn't expect forgiveness but hoped I was doing all right. I didn't respond immediately because I no longer felt the need to. There was no bitterness left, only distance. I eventually wrote back a simple message that said, "I wish you peace." That was all I had to give and all that was needed. One morning I met Laura, the nurse, again purely by chance at the small cafe near the hospital. She recognized me instantly and joined me at the table without hesitation. There was something comforting about her presence, like sitting beside an old friend, even though we barely knew each other outside those sterile hospital rooms. She asked how I had been, and I told her about the new test results. She smiled and said that sometimes medicine has no explanation for why the tide turns, but that I should take it as permission to live again in whatever way made sense. Before leaving, she told me that the hardest part of healing isn't physical, it's learning to re-enter a world you already said goodbye to. That sentence stayed with me all day. Inspired by that conversation, I decided to visit my parents for the first time in months. They knew I had been sick, though I had never shared the full extent of it. When I arrived, they were in the garden pulling weeds together, and when my mother saw me, she smiled with that kind of relief that only mothers can show. We spent the afternoon talking about small things, the kind of meaningless details that fill the gaps where fear might otherwise live. I didn't tell them that the doctors had said the cancer slowed down because I didn't want to give them false hope, but I let myself enjoy the simplicity of being their son again instead of a patient counting days. That night, while driving home, I realized how much lighter I felt. The road stretched ahead under the faint glow of the streetlights, and for the first time in a long while I didn't feel like I was racing against time. I rolled down the window and let the wind fill the car, the cool air carrying the scent of wet asphalt and pine. There was a strange kind of freedom in that moment, not the kind that comes from escaping something, but the kind that comes from no longer fearing where the road ends. In the following weeks, I began to rebuild small pieces of a routine. I cooked meals that took time just to feel the rhythm of chopping and stirring again. I planted a few herbs on the kitchen windowsill because I liked watching something grow under my care. I started taking my camera out with me during walks inspired by Eli's quiet passion for capturing unnoticed details. One evening he showed me how to adjust the aperture to catch the way light falls through tree branches. I took a photo of the sky at dusk, and when I looked at it later it struck me that the image looked both alive and fading at once like everything else in my life. Then one morning I received a message from the hospital asking me to come in for a follow-up scan. My first instinct was hesitation because I had learned to stop expecting good news, but something in me wanted clarity. When I arrived, Laura greeted me again and stayed with me through the process. Later that afternoon, the doctor told me the results showed further stabilization and a few small improvements. He said they still didn't understand it, but whatever I was doing seemed to help. As I left his office, I realized I was smiling genuinely for the first time in months. That night I wrote in my journal that maybe the body sometimes follows the heart's lead and that peace might be its own medicine. I still didn't know how much time I had, but I knew that every day I woke up breathing was a kind of victory. I went to bed with the window open, listening to the quiet hum of the world outside, and thought that maybe the story wasn't about dying anymore. Maybe it was about learning how to live in the soft, uncertain space between endings and beginnings. The first real day of warmth, that spring, arrived quietly with sunlight spilling through the curtains in a way that felt like an invitation, and for the first time in months I woke up without the usual heaviness pressing on my chest. The air smelled faintly of fresh grass and the neighbor's lilac bush, and I remember standing at the window thinking that maybe this was what returning to life looked like, not fireworks or grand gestures, but a slow, gentle thaw. I made coffee without rushing and sat on the porch steps, letting the steam rise into the cool morning air. The world looked ordinary, and that ordinariness felt sacred. In the days that followed, I began to notice that people around me seemed subtly different too, or maybe I was just finally paying attention. The barista at the corner cafe remembered my name and asked if I wanted my usual. The old man who walked his dog every morning nodded at me with the kind of recognition that grows from routine. Eli stopped by more often now, bringing printed photos of his recent work and sometimes asking if I'd critique them, though we both knew he didn't really need my opinion. It was his way of checking in without making it about sympathy. We'd sit on my porch drinking tea while he talked about how photography taught him to look at the world as though every moment could disappear if he blinked too long. I told him that was a pretty good metaphor for living too. I started going to the hospital less frequently since the treatments had been reduced to maintenance. Laura still checked on me now and then through short messages that somehow managed to sound both professional and genuinely warm. Once she invited me to join a small community group she helped organize for patients in remission or recovery, though she said there was no pressure to attend. I hesitated at first because I wasn't sure I belonged in a group of survivors when I still felt like I was hovering between survival and surrender, but eventually I went. The meetings were held in a modest room at the library with mismatched chairs and a pot of weak coffee that somehow tasted better because of the company. There were only a few of us at first: an older woman who knitted through the entire session, a young father who made terrible jokes to hide his fear, and a retired teacher who brought a new kind of cookie each week. We didn't talk about illness as much as we talked about life, what it meant to start over after losing so much of it. I found comfort in their stories, not because they were hopeful in the traditional sense, but because they were real. Every person there carried a kind of quiet courage that didn't need to be spoken aloud. During one meeting, Laura mentioned something that stayed with me. She said that most people think recovery means returning to who you were before, but sometimes recovery means becoming someone new entirely. That sentence echoed in my head long after I left. On my walk home, I realized that I had been trying to rebuild the man I was before the diagnosis, before Emma's betrayal, before everything fell apart, but maybe the truth was that version of me no longer existed. And maybe that was okay. A few weeks later, I decided to reach out to my parents again to tell them the full story of my illness and how things had unexpectedly stabilized. I had kept the worst of it from them before because I didn't want them to carry the weight of helplessness, but now I felt they deserved honesty. When I told them everything, my mother cried quietly and my father just sat there holding her hand, his face a mixture of relief and sadness. He said that sometimes miracles don't announce themselves, they just whisper, "Stay a little longer." Hearing him say that felt like permission to keep living without apology. After that visit, I started taking small trips on weekends, short drives to places I had once promised myself I'd see but never made time for. I visited the lake again, though this time I brought my camera. I took photos of the ripples and the reeds and the sky reflected in the water. I didn't know what I'd do with them, maybe print them, maybe not. The act of capturing them was enough. It felt like reclaiming something I had lost the ability to find beauty without needing it to mean anything. One evening after returning from one of those drives, I found a small envelope tucked under my door. Inside was a short note from Emma. She had written that she had moved to another city to start over, that she was focusing on raising her child and learning how to live with her choices. At the end she wrote that she hoped I had found peace. I folded the letter and placed it in my drawer beside my old journals, not out of nostalgia but closure. It felt right to keep it as proof that even pain can evolve into something gentle over time. The weeks turned into months, and though my health never returned to what it once was, it stabilized enough that I could plan days without fear. I began volunteering at the library, helping organize readings for local writers. It was a small thing, but it gave structure to my days and connection to people who saw me for more than my illness. One afternoon, as I was arranging chairs for an event, I looked up and saw Laura walking in carrying a stack of books. She smiled and said she thought she'd find me here. I laughed and told her that she was partially responsible for my newfound enthusiasm for living. She shrugged and said she just reminded me that I still had chapters left to write. That night, after the event, I walked home under a sky so clear it almost felt deliberate. The air was cool but not cold, and the moonlight stretched across the quiet streets like a soft ribbon. I realized I wasn't waiting for the next test result or the next update anymore. I was simply living one evening at a time. There was a freedom in that simplicity, a relief that no doctor could prescribe. Later, as I sat by the window, I opened my journal again and wrote that I had stopped fearing the end because I had learned that life doesn't end all at once. It fades in and out like the tide, leaving traces on the shore for those who pay attention. I wrote that maybe I wasn't meant to survive forever, but I was meant to survive long enough to understand what survival truly means. When I closed the notebook, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. The world outside was quiet, the streetlights flickered in steady rhythm, and somewhere a train horn echoed faintly in the distance. It felt like the sound of continuity, the reminder that life keeps moving no matter who stays behind. The last summer I can remember clearly began with sunlight pouring through the kitchen window so bright that it painted the floor in soft gold, and I remember standing there barefoot, feeling that warmth against my skin and realizing that I had lived long enough to forget the exact number of days the doctors had once given me. The calendar no longer mattered. My life had become a collection of small, deliberate moments stitched together by ordinary grace. By then my body had grown weaker in ways I could not always predict. Some mornings I woke with a steady pulse of energy enough to water the herbs and take a short walk to the park. Other days the weight of exhaustion pressed on me before I even left the bed. I learned to accept both kinds of days without judgment because each one carried its own kind of purpose. I no longer fought against the rhythm of decline. I simply followed it. Eli visited often during that time, bringing photos he had taken from his travels around the coast. He told me he wanted to capture the way light bends across water because he thought it looked like time itself stretching and breaking. I told him that was a poetic way of describing everything we do without realizing it. We talked for hours, sometimes without needing words, just quiet understanding between two people who had learned that silence can say more than conversation ever could. He offered to help me organize my photos and journal entries into a small book, and though I laughed at the idea at first, he kept gently insisting until one afternoon we actually began. We spread the photos across the table, pairing each with lines I had written during the worst months of my illness. The process felt like assembling proof that I had existed fully even when I thought I was fading. The finished result was a thin handmade book with soft gray pages and no title. I told Eli to keep it, but he insisted that it belonged to me. He said that someday someone would find it and understand that survival isn't about how long you live but how deeply you see while you're still here. I thanked him, though my voice caught slightly, because I knew he was right. That little book wasn't meant to last forever. It was just meant to outlive the fear that once defined me. Laura came by once in a while to check on me, still the same calm, gentle presence she had always been. She told me that the hospital had started a new program for patients who wanted to mentor others and asked if I would consider writing something for them. I smiled and said that I already had, and handed her one of the extra copies of the book Eli and I made. She flipped through it quietly, then looked at me with a softness that said more than any words could. Before leaving, she said that sometimes the greatest medicine a person can give is the story of how they kept breathing when they didn't think they could. The days slowed after that in the way late summer always does, with long evenings and the hum of cicadas filling the air. I spent most of my time on the porch watching the light shift through the trees. Occasionally my parents would visit, bringing homemade soup and gentle scolding about how thin I had become. My mother still tried to hide her worry behind small talk, but I could see it in her eyes. My father would sit beside me in quiet solidarity, and sometimes he would say something simple like "it's a good day today," and I would nod because it always was, no matter how much pain came with it. One morning I woke to find an envelope on my doorstep. It was from Claire, the woman I had spoken to months earlier, the wife of the man who had once shared in my heartbreak. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate. She wrote that she had finally settled into a new life with her child, and that she had come across my name in a community article about the hospital's patient mentors. She thanked me for being kind during that terrible time and wrote that she hoped I was at peace wherever I was now. I smiled at that phrase, "wherever I was now," because it made me realize that I was finally exactly where I needed to be. As the summer drew to its quiet close, I began to tire more easily. The walks became shorter, the nights longer. I felt my strength slipping gradually, like the tide receding from the shore, but I didn't fear it anymore. I had already made my peace with the impermanence of everything. One evening, as the sky turned that soft shade of pink that only happens in late August, I took my camera and walked to the lake one last time. The water was perfectly still, and the reflection of the sky made it hard to tell where the horizon ended. I took a single photo and then set the camera down beside me. Sitting there, I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed over the past year. The man who sat in the doctor's office hearing the word terminal. The man who discovered his wife's betrayal. The man who thought his story had already ended. And the man sitting there now, alive in a way none of the others had been. Each of them had carried me here piece by piece. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind moving through the reeds, and it felt like the sound of forgiveness. Not just for Emma, not just for life itself, but for every version of me that had been afraid to let go. When I returned home that night, I wrote my final journal entry. It wasn't long, just a few sentences. I wrote that I had learned to stop measuring life in years or milestones and instead measure it in quiet mornings and honest moments. I wrote that love is not the opposite of loss, it is the thread that makes loss bearable. And I wrote that if anyone ever found these pages, I hoped they would understand that peace is not something you wait for at the end, it is something you learn to build along the way. I placed the journal beside the little gray book on my bedside table and turned off the light. The room was filled with the gentle hum of the night outside, the soft ticking of the clock, the rhythm of the world still moving forward. I closed my eyes and felt grateful that I had lived long enough to see ordinary days become extraordinary simply because I had finally learned how to notice them. And in that quiet, steady moment between wakefulness and sleep, I understood something I had been trying to grasp all along. Life does not end with a final breath. It ends when you stop seeing its beauty. I smiled faintly because for the first time in a long time I knew I hadn't missed it. I had seen everything.